Kings, King of the Kings, and Lord of Lords. Ready? Yep. King of Hearts, King of Diamonds, King of Clubs, King of Spades. Today we're talking about kings.
Bible.
Okay, so if you open up your English Bible, so the Bibles that we have that are in English, you'll notice that the book of Kings says First King and Second Kings. It's split into two parts, similar to how the book of Samuel, we have First and Second Samuel. But remember that when we look at First and Second Kings, they are part of one story, one book in the ancient Hebrew scriptures. So let's remember that as we dig in to the story of the Bible again, picking up after the book of Samuel. Oh, I forgot this line. Let's dig into the story.
Important.
All right. Do you guys remember King David? Well, King David at the start of this book unfortunately dies, but he's talking to his son Solomon, who's going to take over his position as king, and he says, Solomon, stay faithful to the covenant with God. But if you've learned anything so far about the Bible, anything so far about the people of Israel, anything so far about humanity, well, when we say that we want to be faithful, oftentimes we drift away because, remember, we're living in this broken reality filled with sin, broken reality, and it's just a mess. And the book of Kings, it gets messy, folks. It gets messy. So throughout this book, we see all sorts of kings, and these all sorts of kings, well, they do a pretty bad job at being the types of kings that God designed for them to be. It's just one big mess of corruption, murder, idolatry, etc., etc., etc. Am I saying that right?
That's right.
Perfect. Etc., etc. All of these etceteras of just corruption and sin and brokenness, and it eventually leads to even more sad things because the people of Israel split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom will eventually be called Northern Israel, and the southern kingdom, Southern Judah, and it's just more messy people. All the messy kings up here, all the messy kings down there. Everyone is just messy. Messy kings, messy people. It's rough, and it eventually leads to their exile, which is a big, big bummer. The kings were hashtag failing, like so bad. So bad. I see your laugh back there. That was good, huh?
Real hip.
The kings were hashtag failing. Cue the prophets. So if you remember our first season when we talked about the prophets, the Ketuvim, well, what we learned about the prophets is that they're not these spooky fortune tellers. They're people calling people out, specifically the kings. They are like God's voice saying, okay, stick away from idolatry, stick away from injustice, stick away from your wrongdoings, and they're calling them out. You know when you're like, didn't clean your room and your mom's like, yo, you haven't cleaned your room? You're like, that's kind of what the prophets were doing to the people of Israel, specifically to the kings. These kings were just falling short. They were failing to uphold the covenant with God, and it was getting so bad that God had to send in the prophets to call out the injustice, to call out their wrongdoings. The two most prominent prophets in the book of Kings are Elijah and Elisha. I know it gets confusing, but they're two separate people. These dudes called out the people of Israel. They were calling out the kings, challenging the kings as the kings decided to worship other gods. The kings decided to commit idolatry, and the kings decided to lay away from God's promises, to drift away from God's covenant. They were ruthless, but ruthless because they wanted the people of Israel to stay committed to the covenant that God had established with them, because God is committed to the people of Israel and he's committed to creation despite our broken reality. Long story short, this did not end well for the people of Israel. The book of Kings kind of ends on a bummer note, like in a sad song when it just gets sadder. It's kind of like the book of Kings. You know, it starts off a little promising because in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the book of Samuel, God promises this messianic king who's going to enact God's rescue plan for this broken reality. And there's a glimmer of hope, but then we enter 1st and 2nd Kings and the book of Kings. And just like we saw in the book of Judges and Samuel, people's shortcomings, we see these kings fall short of what God designed kings to be, of what God intended for them, what God intended creation to be, as they continue to live in their broken reality, committing sins, injustices, wrongdoings. It's just a bummer, folks. A bummer. Ultimately, These kings' wrongdoings, these kings' shortcomings, their failings, leads to the exile and destruction of the people of Israel. These guys come in called the Babylonians. They come in, destroy the temple which Solomon created, which was their lifeline to God. Similar to how the tabernacle was where God's presence dwelled, the temple was the people's lifeline to Yahweh. And this book ends with its destruction. In the beginning of Kings, the book of Kings, Solomon builds God a temple, and in the end, in 2 Kings, it is destroyed. It seems like all hope is lost. There's a tiny glimmer of hope at the end, because remember, even though it's a big bummer in this story and we keep seeing people failing, God is committed to his people Israel. God is committed to creation, and God is committed to you and me as we continue to journey through the great story of the Bible from Acts 1 to 5. God is committed to creation. And that, folks, is the book of Kings.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that.